Hello, 5th graders. Today I'm reading the story Woodsong by Gary Paulsen. Try to make text-to-text connections to our last story, I Did a Raw Dream. That will really help your comprehension. I encourage you to hit mute on your computer and try the story on your own too. To slow it down, simply hit pause until you finish reading the page. Okay, let's start. Woodsong by Gary Paulsen. Author Gary Paulsen once lived deep in the Minnesota wilderness in the company of 41 sled dogs. He observed these beautiful animals closely, made connections with many of them, and learned powerful lessons about toughness, trust, and teamwork. It is always possible to learn from dogs, and in fact, the longer I'm with them, the more I understand how little I know. But there was one dog who taught me the most. Just one dog. Storm. First dog. He has already been spoken of once here when he taught me about heart and the will to pull. There was more to him, so much more that he in truth could take a whole book. Joy, loyalty, toughness, peacefulness, all of these were part of Storm. Lessons about life and finally, lessons about death came from him. He had a bear's ears. He was brindle-colored and built like a truck, and his ears were rounded when we got him so that they looked like bear cub ears. They gave him a comical look when he was young that somehow hung on to him even when he grew old. He had a sense of humor to match his ears, and when he grew truly old, he somehow resembled George Burns. At peak, he was a mighty dog. He pulled like a machine until we retired him and used him only for training puppies. Until we let him loose to enjoy his age, he pulled his back over in the power curve so that nothing could stop the sled. In his 4th or 5th year as a puller, he started doing tricks. First he would play jokes on the dog pulling next to him. On long runs he would become bored, and when we least expected it, he would reach across the gang line and snort wind into the ear of the dog next to him. I ran him with many different dogs, and he did it to all of them, chuckling when the dog jumped and shook his or her head. But I never saw a single dog get mad at him for it. Oh, there was once a dog named Fonzie who nearly took his head off. Fonzie wasn't really mad at him so much as surprised. Fonzie once nailed me through the wrist for waking him up too suddenly when he was sleeping. I'd reached down and touched him before whispering his name. Small jokes, gentle jokes Storm played. He took to hiding things from me. At first I couldn't understand where things were going. I would put a booty down while working on a dog and it would disappear. I lost a small ladle I used for watering each dog, a cloth glove liner I took off while working on a dog's feet, a roll of tape, and finally, a hat. He was so clever. When I lost the hat, it was a hot day, and I had taken the hat off while I worked on a dog's harness. The dog was just ahead of Storm, and when I kneeled to work on the harness, he'd chewed almost through the side of it while running. I put the hat down on the snow near Storm, or thought I had. When I had changed the dog's harness, I turned and the hat was gone. I looked around, moved the dogs, looked under them, then shrugged. First I was sure I'd put the hat down, then, when I couldn't find it, I became less sure, and at last I thought perhaps I had left it at home or dropped it somewhere on the run. Storm sat quietly, looking ahead down the trail, not showing anything at all. I went back to the sled, reached down to disengage the hook, and when I did, the dogs exploded forward. I was not quite on the sled when they took off, so I was knocked slightly off balance. I leaned over to the right to regain myself, and when I did, I accidentally dragged the hook through the snow and pulled up my hat. It had been buried off to the side of the trail in the snow, buried neatly with the snow smoothed over the top so that it was completely hidden. Had the snow hook not scraped down 4 or 5 inches, I never would have found it. I stopped the sled and set the hook once more. While knocking the snow out of the hat and putting it back on my head, I studied where it had happened, right next to Storm. He had taken the hat, quickly dug a hole, buried the hat, and smoothed the snow over it, then gone back to sitting, staring ahead, looking completely innocent. When I stopped the sled and picked up the hat, he looked back, saw me put the hat on my head, and, I swear, smiled. Then he shook his head once and went back to work, pulling. Along with the jokes, Storm had scale eyes. He watched as the sled was loaded, carefully calculated the weight of each item, and let his disapproval be known if it went too far. One winter, a friend gave us a parlor stove with nickel trim. It was not an enormous stove, but it had some weight to it and some bulk. This friend lived 12 miles away, 12 miles over 2 fair hills, followed by about 8 miles on an old, abandoned railroad grade. We needed the stove badly. Our old barrel stove had started to burn through, so I took off with the team to pick it up. I left early in the morning because I wanted to get back that same day. It had snowed 4 or 5 inches, so the dogs would have to break trail. By the time we had done the hills and the railroad grade, pushing in new snow all the time, they were ready for a rest. I ran them the last 2 miles to where the stove was and unhooked their tugs so they could rest while I had coffee. We stopped for an hour at least, the dogs sleeping quietly. When it was time to go, my friend and I carried the stove outside and put it in the sled. The dogs didn't move, except for Storm. He raised his head, opened one eye, did a perfect double take, both eyes opening wide, and sat up. He had been facing the front. Now he turned around to face the sled. So he was facing away from the direction we had to travel when we left, and watched us load the sled. It took some time as the stove barely fit on the sled and had to be jiggled and shuffled around to get it down between the side rails. Through it all, Storm sat and watched us, his face a study in interest. He did not get up, but sat on his back end, and when I was done and ready to go, I hooked all the dogs back in harness, which involved hooking the tugs to the rear ties on their harnesses. The dogs knew this meant we were going to head home, so they got up and started slamming against the tugs, trying to get the sled to move. All of them, that is, but Storm. Storm sat backward, the tug hooked up but hanging down. The other dogs were screaming to run, but Storm sat and stared at the stove. Not at me, not at the sled, but at the stove itself. Then he raised his lips, bared his teeth, and growled at the stove. When he was finished growling, he snorted twice, stood, turned away from the stove, and started to pull. But each time we stopped at the tops of the hills to let the dogs catch their breath after pulling the sled and stove up the steep incline, Storm turned and growled at the stove. The enemy, the weight on the sled. I do not know how many miles Storm and I ran together. 8, 10, perhaps 12,000 miles. He was one of the first dogs and taught me the most, and as we worked together, he came to know me better than perhaps even my own family. He could look once at my shoulders and tell how I was feeling, tell how far we were to run, how fast we had to run, knew it all. When I started to run long, moved from running a work team, a trapline team, to training for the Iditarod, Storm took it in stride, changed the pace down to the long trot, matched what was needed, and settled in for the long haul. He did get bored, however, and one day while we were running a long run, he started doing a thing that would stay with him, with us, until the end. We had gone 40 or 50 miles on a calm, even day with no bad wind. The temperature was a perfect 10 below zero. The sun was bright, everything was moving well, and the dogs had settled into the rhythm that could take them 100 or 1,000 miles. And Storm got bored. At a curve in the trail, a small branch came out over the path we were running, and as Storm passed beneath the limb, he jumped up and grabbed it, broke a short piece off, about a foot long, and kept it in his mouth, all day, and into the night. He ran, carrying the stick like a toy, and when we stopped to feed or rest, he would put the stick down, eat, then pick it up again. He would put the stick down carefully in front of him or across his paws and sleep. And when he awakened, he would pick up the stick, and it soon became a thing between us, the stick. He would show it to me, making a contact, a connection between us, each time we stopped. I would pet him on top of the head and take the stick from him. He would emit a low, gentle growl when I took the stick. I'd examine it closely, nod, and seem to approve of it, and hand it back to him. Each day we ran, he would pick up a different stick, and each time I would have to approve of it, and after a time, after weeks and months, I realized that he was using the sticks as a way to communicate with me, to tell me that everything was all right, that I was doing the right thing. Once when I pushed them too hard during a pre-Iditarod race, when I thought it was important to compete and win, a feeling that didn't last long, I walked up to Storm, and as I came close to him, he pointedly dropped the stick. I picked it up and held it out, but he wouldn't take it. He turned his face away. I put the stick against his lips and tried to make him take it, but he let it fall to the ground. When I realized what he was doing, I stopped and fed and rested the team, sat on the sled, and thought about what I was doing wrong. After 4 hours or so of sitting, watching other teams pass me, I fed them another snack, got ready to go, and was gratified to see Storm pick up the stick. From that time forward, I looked for the stick always, knew when I saw it out to the sides of his head that I was doing the right thing, and it was always there. Through storms and cold weather, on the long runs, the long, long runs, where there isn't an end to it, where only the sled and the winter around the sled and the wind are there, Storm had the stick to tell me it was right. All things were right. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story. Try reading by yourself this time. If you already read it by yourself, just listen to it this time. Thanks for viewing. Feel free to give it a thumbs up on YouTube if this was helpful for you. See you soon.